Welcome. We are so glad to have you with us today for this conversation, A Culture of Encounter in a COVID-19 World. My name is Marcus Mescher. I'm Associate Professor of Christian Ethics at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I'm honored and grateful for this opportunity to join you today. And I'm also joined with a number of other specialists in exploring the possibilities of encounter. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Sure, I'll go first. So I'm Tracy Horan. I'm a Sister of Providence, and I'm the Associate Director of Education and Advocacy with the Kino Border Initiative located in Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora. Good to be here.
My name is Francisco Mena. I am the Executive Director of CRISPAZ, and we work from El Salvador and host groups from the United States mainly, but also from Canada and Australia. And again, also very excited and looking forward to this conversation.
I am Beth Szczepaniak, and I am the Director of Service and Justice at Loyola Blakefield in Towson, Maryland, and also very excited to be with you all today.
Great, thank you so much. I'm a proud and grateful product of 14 years of Jesuit education, starting at Marquette High, then Marquette University, and then Boston College. And one of the things that I treasure most about the Ignatian tradition is the advice to tap into our deepest desires and to allow our imagination to stretch what we envision for ourselves to be and to do. And so in the spirit of this year's theme on prophetic resilience, I wanted to begin our time together thinking about a prophetic imagination that stretches what we imagine possible so that we don't settle for something less than what God is calling and empowering us to be and to do in the world today. And it seems fitting to begin our conversation with Pope Francis's call to build a culture of encounter. For Pope Francis, he has presented this culture of encounter as a personal practice of the revolution of tenderness that he called us to participate in Evangelii Gaudium. And it's an invitation to see Christ in and be Christ for all those we meet. I think as we look at our lives, we can see that to live is to encounter, and these encounters make us more us and help us to see the world in a different perspective. And it's crucial for Christian discipleship and evangelization to focus on encounters, because this is exactly what Jesus modeled for us. He was someone who met people exactly where they were. He met with the oppressed and the oppressors, the people of status and privilege and power, and those who had none. He met them right where they were and accompanied them and empowered them. And this is an invitation, this culture of encounter, to do the same thing in our social context today. But Pope Francis is a little bit light on details on what a culture of encounter might look like in our social context in the United States. So today I'll be speaking from a book that I published earlier this year with Orbis called The Ethics of Encounter, Christian Neighbor Love as a Practice of Solidarity, which tries to explore what it would take to put this vision of a culture of encounter into practice in American context that's marked by a lot of social fragility and fragmentation. And that was before a pandemic hit us. It hit our country and changed and displaced so many of us from the roles and relationships and responsibilities that we were used to, throwing our routines out of whack. And so today in our conversation, we're going to try to look at both of these sets of circumstances in front of us, our social context riddled by so much racial and class segregation and distrust and division, unjust inequalities, as well as this pandemic that has caused so much disruption and so much pain for so many. So to begin with our social context, not to be too much of a Debbie Downer from the start, but studies show that Americans really lament the state of our social life today. And many report that the country seems more bitterly divided than in anyone's living memory. And all these social divisions, all these reasons for distrust, the macro identities that we put on, whether it's by political party or any other ideology, it puts people into these us versus them camps, these very simplistic binaries that we kind of cling to so that we can convince ourselves that we're on the right side or on the winning side. And in addition to giving rise to a lot of self-righteousness, it also unfortunately gives rise to a lot of contempt for those people that we ascribe to the other side or the other camp, the them in the us versus them equation, which is tearing apart not only communities like our schools and parishes, but also even families, where it's getting harder and harder to talk to people across differences. And these are problems bigger than empathy, kindness, civility, and tolerance can solve. And I hear my students very often say something like, I do me, you do you, or I stay in my lane, you stay in yours, which sounds nice at first blush. It sounds like non-judgmentalism and tolerance, but it's not actually true. Right? If someone starts stealing your belongings, you don't say, oh, this is how you do you, that's good to know. Or if someone repeatedly lies to you or deceives you or tries to manipulate you, we're not okay with that. But it is, in this I do me, you do you framework, it is getting harder and harder to identify the moral norms necessary for agreement and accountability, leaving people disoriented and without sure footing on where to turn. And so I think it's very fitting that we begin our conversation looking at encounters and trying to return to this idea that we belong to each other, invoking that line from Mother Teresa, if we do not have peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. And I don't know if you've seen this image before, but it's actually on a billboard here in Cincinnati. And I take issue with it because it suggests that we have lost the ability to recognize each other as neighbors. So I'm going to change it here. Not I used to be your neighbor, but I am your neighbor, right? That there are no non-neighbors. And encounters give us this invitation to change those perspectives, to recognize our biases and blind spots. And I have two quick examples. Encounters are transformative because they help us see the world with new eyes. They help us to see ourselves and others and the whole world from a different perspective, just like this statue illustrates. There's nothing I could say that would probably convince you that this statue is anything other than two giraffes. But if you move your feet, you see that there's actually more to this image. And similarly, with this image, when you have an encounter that helps you to see the world with a different set of lenses, you can see that this square is also more than something that initially just looks like a square, which makes encounter an opportunity to have kaleidoscopic vision. There's always more ways to look at ourselves, others, and the world. And that's why I think encounter is such a rich focal theme for us today, to think about the ways in which encounter can burst bubbles and stereotypes, help us become aware of our assumptions and biases. And also the more that we encounter others, it can diminish anxiety, that we can see that these encounters, even across difference, don't have to be as scary as we might build them up to be in our minds. And certainly the need for resilience to keep at these encounters, even when they might not go exactly as we had in mind, but to keep making efforts to be people who look for the equal dignity in the people that we meet, to live like we are equals in God's eyes, to be bridge builders in a time of so much distrust and division. So in the book, I spell out 5 virtues as the backbone for the ethics of encounter, and they're inspired by the example of the Samaritan in Luke's gospel, a story that we all know very well, but I think we've domesticated. Right? When we hear that story, we know, okay, the Samaritan is the hero and the person that I need to be like. But we lose the radical edge to this story when we don't understand what it was like for Jesus' original hearers. And because we've heard it so often, even the lawyer's question, who is my neighbor, just seems like an innocent question to us. But it's a limit-seeking question, right? It's like, how fast can I go over the speed limit before I'm going to get pulled over? Or will this be on the test? That way I know whether or not I have to worry about this. Right? It implies there's a non-neighbor, someone beyond my moral concern or religious obligation. And Jesus used this story to turn that question upside down and to make sure that there are no non-neighbors. And when we look at the details of this story, you know, it's the only parable that's geographically located on this road from Jerusalem to Jericho, a road that was notoriously unsafe. You know, Jerusalem is the center of religion, Jericho is the center of commerce, and because it was, you know, a route for trade, people were carrying money on that road, and bandits knew that. So this was a road where there were lots of ambushes, especially because of all the switchback turns due to the change in elevation between Jerusalem and Jericho. So Jesus' audience has absolutely no sympathy for the man who's beaten, robbed, and left for dead. In their minds, he got what was coming to him because he's an idiot to walk that road by himself. And the priest and the Levite who walked down that road, right, we might justify that they had a long to-do list, lots of things to do, ritual purity, whatever it might be. But I think it's interesting that in Luke's gospel, he says that when the priest and the Levite see the man who's beaten, robbed, and left for dead, they actually go to the other side of the road. They create greater distance between them and the man who's beaten, robbed, and left for dead. They are, in a sense, the anti-neighbor, the ones who refuse to draw near and to see the man beaten and robbed and left for dead as their neighbor. So when we think about some of these details, we see in the Samaritan tremendous courage, not only to go into the ditch where he could have been ambushed, but also courage to go into the inn where he's also a despised outcast. Right? For Jesus's original hearers, they could not imagine a worse villain than a Samaritan. He is the most despised outcast they could imagine. And for us, it's hard to come up with an equivalent, but I think it's someone that, you know, makes our skin crawl or our stomach turn. And this is the person that we're supposed to go and do likewise, sending us the message, you know, that there shouldn't be people that make our skin crawl or our stomach turn. But again, thinking about the courage that the Samaritan models, and to the compassion, the mercy. Luke's text says that the Samaritan is moved not by a cerebral conception of justice or some holy religious obligation, but the text in Greek says that his bowels were wrenched or his heart was melting. Right? He has this visceral connection, maybe because he was a despised outcast. He can more readily identify with a man who's been beaten, robbed, and left for dead. I think this is a beautiful illustration of what mercy makes possible when we do try to connect with people on a human level and push past those labels or those us versus them camps. Right? The Samaritan shows us there is no us and them, there is only us. And he acts with generosity, providing care right there on the side of the road, right, using the oil and the wine, which, you know, Jesus inserts those details because that's what the priest and Levite would be using for their liturgical practices, right? So what the priest and Levite are using as sacrifice to God, the Samaritan is using in an act of mercy. And he pays for the robber's victim's convalescence for 2 weeks' care, right? Using the means at his disposal. But also, I think, models humility for us, right? Aquinas tells us that humility is telling the truth about ourselves, seeing the good and the bad, embracing our finitude rather than fleeing from it. The Samaritan goes on his way. He doesn't leave his family or forsake his job and try to prevent other people from falling victim to robbers. He does what he can, no more and no less. And it's an important lesson to us that's the invitation here, that we do what we can, no more and no less. And then finally, fidelity. You know, in Pope Francis's newest encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, Francis teaches us that we not only are equals in God's eyes, but we are all members of a single human family, a single family of creation, all siblings in God's family. And the Samaritan models that, even as a despised outcast, that no one is outside, no one should be an outcast, and that we have to stretch our bonds of fidelity so that they exclude no one. I think encounter is also really important for us today because there is such a preference to charity or to philanthropy or to service, these acts that are more unilateral and very often doing for rather than being with. And that's one of the reasons why I try to work and specialize in solidarity, is because solidarity implies not only inclusion or interdependence, but a robust sense of mutuality. And when we take solidarity seriously, we see that philanthropy and charity are totally inadequate to the demands of justice. And that even as people become more aware of inequality and talking more about what is required for equality or even equity, that these too fall short, that it's not enough to try to take inequality into account and to try to render a more even playing field, but we actually have to interrupt the cycles of unjust inequality to prevent injustice from continuing. And encounters can be that first exposure to injustice that help us prick our conscience and help us hear the cries of those who are rendered insignificant, the non-persons, not just by socioeconomic class, but any category where people are kind of pushed beyond our attention or our concern, people who've been rendered invisible and unheard, and calls us to work for solidarity and inclusion and interdependence on the personal level, on the interpersonal level, and the institutional level. But how do we do that through a screen, right? The pandemic has meant not only that we're wearing masks and physically distancing from each other, but that we have to limit the sizes of our groups and cancel a lot of the travel we have planned. I was actually in El Salvador when COVID hit, and we caught the group of students I was with, and I caught one of the last flights out of El Salvador. And as I've been thinking about that experience, which most of my students called life-changing or the highlight of their time at Xavier, I've been trying to figure out, is it possible to replicate this through a screen? On the one hand, screens are amazing portals for connection. We're enjoying this conversation together right now, thanks to our screens. But on the other hand, they can also become a buffer that make things catered to our interests, or that make things more focused on entertaining us than what might challenge us. And certainly given the way that so many people use screens today, there's so much objectification and dehumanization, not only in the words, or not only in the images we see, but in the words people use, and the toxic way that people treat each other, either hiding behind a cloak of anonymity, or just in embracing a total lack of accountability, that there's no follow through on what they might be able to spout off online. So we have to account for some of these dangers, like the depersonalization that's happening, the limits to our ability to really concentrate and focus, the shrinking attention spans of ourselves and our students, the way that screens can be used as endless sources of distraction and procrastination, and also the limits of empathy. You know, empathy is really parochial. We tend to empathize with people who look like us and think like us, with whom we can readily identify. So it's not always easy to empathize with someone who looks differently, or who believes in things that I don't believe, or says things that challenge my worldview. And it's also temporary, right? It's a feeling that can be fleeting, and we can see this in the outrage that people might cast about a particular issue or cause or person, and then we just move on like business as usual. And so it's important that we find ways to interrupt the half-life of online empathy, and to try to make these sustainable commitments to each other. And also, I think screens can also disempower people, that they train us to see ourselves as consumers and as spectators more than stakeholders. And so these are some of the challenges we want to address, and also some of the opportunities we want to leverage in turning our conversation to the experience and expertise of the panelists, to think about the way that that narrative can humanize and bring in voices from the margins and the peripheries. I think about this all the time on Twitter, for example, right? I have access to indigenous voices and people all over the globe that I would not have access to if I relied solely on the news media for perspectives on various issues. And there are so many of us who feel isolated and helpless, not just because of the unjust inequalities we face, but also because of the pandemic. And our screens, when used appropriately, can be used to cultivate mutual vulnerability and authenticity, a give and take reciprocity, where it's not just I show up and you tell me my story, but we share our stories together and stitch solidarity through sharing our narratives and sharing our burdens, and also sharing what gives us joy and all the reasons that we have for hope. And that's something that I hope we can explore in the remainder of our conversation. I think as a moral theologian, the last thing I just want to say is that everything that we see from sociology and psychology is that our moral identity and character and agency is best demonstrated in what we repeatedly do together. That it's not just about habits building character, but it's actually the shared practices in relationships with friends and family, that these communities of practice have more to say about who we become, what we believe and value, our sense of belonging and purpose and accountability, that really comes out of our shared practices in our schools and churches and other organizations, much more than anything I might teach or that anyone might preach. And so there's an invitation here for us to push our imagination, to expand what's possible, for envisioning wherever we are as a community of practice that tries to start with encounter and move toward solidarity. So for the rest of our time together, we're going to focus on what does this look like in the concrete, drawing from the experience and expertise of our panelists. So what does it take to prepare and process encounters with students, which Beth Ann will speak to. How we can harness relationships to link individuals and institutions, which is modeled so well for us in CRISPAZ and their emphasis on dialogue and nonviolence in El Salvador and beyond. And then also trying to connect the personal to the structural, and moving from narrative experience to advocacy and being advocates and allies for the work of structural change and social justice, which Tracy and the Kino Border Initiative will illustrate well for us. So as I turn things over, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And we now turn to a conversation. I'd like to start with you, Beth Ann, if that's all right. Maybe you could just start out in light of the convention theme this year on prophetic resilience. Could you speak to how you see your ministry at Loyola Blakefield through this lens? And maybe give us a few examples of how you're trying to be creative and stretching what's possible for yourself and for your students in terms of prophetic resilience.
Yeah, of course. So I think in terms of prophetic resilience, where I have focused our attention is how to create virtual encounters that still inspire students to want to have future encounters, that for students to want to meet people and engage with people that they may meet virtually at first, but give them the inspiration and the tools necessary to meet them in person and have these experiences in person. I think encounters are so essential for middle and high school students developmentally. It's the place where they start to transition from being people of completing charitable acts to being people who want to work in solidarity. Just like Marcus had said, how do you developmentally change that attitude for being a person who's helping and offering resources to a person who wants to be with somebody, who wants to get to know them, who wants to share, who has mutual respect, who wants to share mutual respect with somebody. And I think that's where encounters are so important. When we can't have encounters, how can we still inspire that desire to meet people and to share and be present? So since we couldn't have our typical service encounters this summer and even last school year, the idea that we created at Loyola was to have these virtual service justice weeks. And we focused on social justice topics like immigration, racial equity, environmental justice, education reform. And the purpose was to certainly educate and to learn about the topics, but also to engage with people that are working in the fields, that are working day to day, and truly people of solidarity. I think you become a person that's working in areas of social justice because you've had encounters and you've had really positive, impactful encounters. So our hope was to bring in speakers that can share their encounters and inspire our students, again, to want to have those encounters. So for example, we were talking about racial equity. We had a local organization, the executive director, who was able to talk with us. And again, something else that's great is that somebody that they might not meet when they go and serve at the organization. They're not necessarily going to meet with the executive director and hear from the executive director. And the focus of the talk wasn't about, tell us about your organization. That's a little bit, but it was more of, tell us about you. Tell us about how did you get involved? How did you found and develop this community center? And that was really inspiring. So he talked about having his MBA and working in finance. And I think the students could really relate to that because that's probably along, maybe the projection of their careers. And he said, talked about how he just wanted to give back and do something for this community, which again, I think resonates with our students. And then he talked about how he went into the neighborhood and started talking to the residents in the neighborhood and listening to the residents in the neighborhood and hearing from them and having meetings with local ministers and local politicians. And he just told story after story about what he learned from the residents. And those encounters that he had inspired him to open a community development center. And he continues to have those encounters day and day. What happened then is our students now want to meet him, and they are planning a project to meet him and go to his center and work at his center, and they want to see the neighborhood and they want to see the effects that the community center is having and meet the people in the neighborhood. So it might not be ideal, but you can hear about encounters and be inspired by encounters and then hopefully want to do that in the future. And again, I hope that it's allowing them to develop that sense of solidarity. Like, I want to have these encounters so I learn more. So that's a little bit about what we may have done and hopefully how we can present that prophetic resilience.
Great, thanks Beth Ann. Francisco, how about you? Could you speak a little bit about how you see your work with CRISPAZ through the lens of prophetic resilience and the adjustments that you've had to make since March, and how this might be an opportunity for you to stretch what's possible with CRISPAZ?
Yeah, sure. Prophetic resilience, I think, is something that is I think, it could apply not only to this time, obviously, but it could apply to just in general, especially how Salvadorans and Latin Americans view this concept of memoria histórica, which is the historical memory and this intentionality of keeping stories in the past alive. And it's not just for the sake of remembering what's happening, but it's looking at the future and looking at this issue of being prophetic about how we must conduct our lives today, taking into account what we've learned in the past to have a better future. So I think the experience of El Salvador and the resilience that Salvadorans have shown is uniquely attached to this prophetic resilience. And I'll add that it's not only Salvadorans. I think Latin Americans in general have this concept of memoria histórica that's very much alive. And the idea of memoria histórica is to inform ourselves and how to be better in the future. And that ties into the prophetic aspect of it. And I think this is something we need to continue to do regardless of the pandemic, and that we have been doing even with, pre-COVID. So the resilience, I think, is important. It's important to show that this human dynamic has been present, and in the context of the COVID, I think, I said, we need to speak about it even outside of the context, but in the context of COVID, I think is extremely important. One of the things that we have been trying to talk about is a group of, and it's actually a large group of Salvadorans who had to live in refugee camps during the war. And that, not knowing what their future was going to hold for them, but that resilience that they had allowed them to come through in a different way. The community that they built through that, and the resilience that came out of that community are examples that continue to inform us today to construct a better tomorrow. So as CRISPAZ, we want to highlight those experiences. So hopefully we can learn from them and understand that studying the past isn't just remembering events, remembering specific dates, or it's really of understanding how we use that to build a better future. These are tools that we must use, that we have to use to build a better future for all of us.
Yeah, thanks, Francisco. And Tracy, could you speak a little bit about how your ministry, especially on the border, has been pushed, because of COVID, but also is a new opportunity for you to practice prophetic resilience?
Yeah, so I think, talking specifically about the student groups that come down and that experience of encounter, we had this experience where in March we had a lot of groups, all of a sudden COVID happened and people were canceling. And so we thought, well, we just won't have groups for a while. And we actually had a school reach out to us, and their students were so disappointed, and they had actually continued to meet virtually as a group that was preparing to come down and have this immersion experience with us. And one of the students was really, felt really passionate about this issue and said, well, could we do something virtual? And so that was actually the impetus for us to start thinking about, could we do a virtual immersion? And that was the starting point. So I think really that a piece of it came really from the students, from the impetus of a school where they didn't want to accept the outcome of not having any experience of encounter at all. And so seeing that resilience in them really inspired us to do that. And we've had about a dozen virtual immersion experiences since then. And I think too, it's been really neat to see, working with migrants here in Nogales. The border has been closed to asylum seekers now for 5 or 6 months. And so folks are really stuck here. And that has a lot of negative consequences. Sorry. That has a lot of negative consequences for the migrants, obviously, and their families. And it also has meant that people are around for longer and they form certain bonds, and we've been able to start to organize this Save Asylum campaign. And so it's been really powerful to see the way that the students, as they come to these virtual immersions and talk with migrants, now there is, they can kind of feed off of the resilience of the migrants that have been through so much and now are deciding to organize marches and protests. And so there's a different sort of experience when, a migrant can share their story with a group, and then at the end they can say, listen, I'm organizing these marches. I'm a part of this group, this coalition, that's standing up for our rights and sharing our stories. And I want you to join me in that. And so, you know, now I'm calling on you to take action when you go back and be part of these virtual events and support us in that way. And so it's been really beautiful to see how this space that we've created for the migrants, as well as the virtual space that we're inviting students into, how that resilience, how that energy, they can feed off of each other. And so it makes people feel, in my experience, the students, for them, it kind of broadens their perspective. It gives them a positive sort of outlet for that energy that they have to still be involved and to still make an impact. So it's been really beautiful to kind of see that unfold in the past 6 months.
Great. Thanks, Tracy. Beth Ann, I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit more about how you see your role in terms of processing, you know, facilitating these reflection or these encounters with students through reflection, you know, what's essential for them to know beforehand so that they can be properly prepared, but then also looking, you know, to the ultimate goal to integrate this encounter into who they become.
Yeah, and I want to share kind of 4 simple questions that I use with my students, 2 before and 2 after. I love how Marcus framed an encounter, coming into an encounter from a place of humility and a place of courage, because I think when you are a high school and middle school student and you kind of have this attitude of generosity and you're learning about how to be charitable, how do you take those steps developmentally to become a person of solidarity where you show empathy and compassion, and you come into a situation with humility and recognizing that you don't have the answers and that you don't have that savior complex. We're not there to help, but you know, we're there to learn and we're there to be present. I think service encounters so often at the middle school and high school level serve to help break down the us-them barrier. It helps students recognize that there's no those people. You know, we're not going to serve those people. That the experience is more than that. It's more than just the service, and breaking down those biases that they bring to the table. So in terms of preparation, one of the first questions I ask is just, you know, are you going to be a little bit uncomfortable where you're going today? And try to pull some answers like, yeah, we're going to be nervous. Well, why are you going to be nervous? Well, it's a new place, it's new people, we've never been there before. I try to normalize that a little bit. And I try to say, well, wouldn't you be nervous if you went to a new math class today and you had a new teacher and it was new students and it was a new routine and new homework? We're like, oh yeah. And I try to normalize this process. Like, you're going to go someplace and you're going to be nervous, but that's okay. And that's a normal reaction. It's what you do after. It's how much do you push yourself beyond? And so I try to start there. Like, it's okay to be nervous. It's okay to be uncomfortable, but what happens after is really important. I don't try to normalize the sense of trivializing either. I don't want to make the experience trivial. I also want to bring some humanity into the experience, right? So the second question I sometimes ask or lead into is, how might the people we meet today feel about you? What might they think of you? Are they going to be nervous meeting you? And they can start to recognize that the folks that we're going to engage with today are probably feeling some of the same things. Maybe they're nervous to meet us and share their story with us. Maybe they're nervous about how we're going to view them. And we can talk about bias and prejudice, that maybe the people we meet today might have some bias against us and maybe we have some bias against them, like breaking down those us-them barriers. You know, we can easily talk about what it's like to be the suburban kid going to Baltimore City with a shirt and tie, coming down in their nice, you know, new fancy van. And what bias and prejudice does that bring? And so that can help them think about, well, what bias and prejudice are you bringing to the experience? So I think in preparation, I try to help them establish those normalcies or normalize the experience. It's okay to be uncomfortable. It's what you do after. It's how you push yourself after and how you extend yourself after. And it's good to recognize that there's going to be some bias and prejudice. And what's important is that you have that humility, right? That you go in with a sense of humility and openness, and a willingness to learn and be present. So I think those are 2 ways to prepare. Two ways to process, and I'm sorry, I'm going on. Two ways that have processed that have been really powerful is, I call it the principal question. I asked the students, if the principal came in here and said, we're not doing these trips anymore, it's too many students off campus, it's too many faculty, it's too expensive to fund this, we're not doing it. I asked students, how would you respond? And they all say, no, like, you can't take away these service experiences. This is so important. And then we process that. Well, why is it important? And they say, they start to recognize, well, it's because I got to meet somebody. Because I was able to go to a neighborhood that I would never go to otherwise. I got to see a place where I would never experience otherwise, and maybe get a different perspective. It was outside of books, it was outside of our school, and that was really vital. So they start to recognize that it's the encounter that's vital, maybe not so much the books and the understanding, but it's the encounter that made it worthwhile. And the last question is, well, what advice would you give to your classmates? They're going to go next week, next month, next year. What advice would you give them? And that's where they can kind of process the impact it had on them. And they start saying things like, oh, I would tell them not to be nervous. I would tell them to be open. I would tell them to try hard, and to be really present in the moment, and not to dismiss the experience. So it's helping them process the recognition that that encounter was really vital because you were present, and set the stage for the next encounter. You know, now I know that if I'm open, and if I go and try not to think about my bias or hold on to my prejudice, that maybe I can have a worthwhile experience. So those are 4 really great questions that have been powerful for processing and preparing. So that was a little bit long, I apologize, but they've been really
Don't apologize. Don't apologize. That was really helpful. Thanks. As I mentioned, I was in El Salvador in March with a group of students, but I also was there last November for the 30th anniversary of the UCA martyrs' assassination. There's my poster from last year. And as I was reflecting on the experience with colleagues, faculty, staff, and students, we recounted the cariño of the Salvadoran people, just the warmth, the tenderness, the affection that we experienced. The confianza, the trust, like this sacred trust that the Salvadorans put in us to share their stories. But ultimately, also this sense of conjunto, this togetherness, like we are in this together. And Francisco, I was hoping that you could talk to us a little bit about how you see relationships being vital for not only connecting individuals to institutions and building bridges across borders, but also how to make this a long-term sustainable commitment.
Sorry, forgot to unmute myself. But that aspect of Salvadorans is one that many people have mentioned, and I obviously as a Salvadoran see it in my people. I'm very proud of that openness that we have, and I think it's a realization that we need to share what we went through in a very honest and very intentional way. And what we went through is something we don't wish other people would have to go through. We live in societies where we think a war is a solution to a problem. So our message is one that we feel that it's kind of like our duty to share with whomever is willing to listen, so they can understand what happens to a country that goes through a war, what happens to communities when they go through a war. And we hope that people take these messages with the notion that nonviolence has to be present in how we deal with our, dialogues and actions that are, being thought about as we speak today. And I think Salvadorans have understood that we must do this in a place of confianza. We don't want to be, wagging our finger at people. We want to do it in a way that's really open and it's not judgmental. And let's have this serious conversation, but in a non-threatening way. And I think that allows for the connection to be healthier. I think it allows for the connections to be carried on beyond the experience. You know, they stay longer in people's, not only mind, but heart. And you know, I don't think we do this by design, which is, I think, I think an interesting thing. It's part of our nature, I think, and it's fortunately it's been working well. I think going back to how I started this, because it's being done authentically. Like I said, our intention isn't to be wagging our finger at people. It is to truly, hopefully, get it, you know, and understand it by hearing the personal testimonies, by hearing and seeing what violent actions happen, what violent actions do to a country, and what happens in countries where polarization just keeps growing and tolerance becomes absent. In the last years, our role in CRISPAZ has been highlighted by the fact that the U.S. is currently going through a very polarizing time, just as you mentioned, Marcus. And I think we've wanted to become better at telling the story of El Salvador precisely because of that, because we want people to understand that polarization as it's happening right now isn't the worst that it can be. It isn't the final result of people not being able to have healthy discussions. So for us, our connections, that encounter and being authentic in how we talk about it is extremely important. And I think in the way that one does it with real, I think we need to acknowledge where other people are as well. We can't just assume people need to get there right away. I think we need to be open to having a conversation where there might be a little bit of frustration, there might be a little bit of just patience, but we need to engage in it with our mind and with our hearts open. We need to engage in conversation also with the assumption that someone on the other side probably knows something I don't know. And I think as Salvadorans, this is how we engage these encounters. We do it by being authentic and sharing the story, but ultimately with a goal in mind, which is to share with people how important it is to use nonviolence in our dialogues and in our actions.
Yeah, thanks, Francisco. Tracy, I think that sets you up to talk about how do you move past that polarization in Nogales. Immigration has to be one of the biggest hot button issues right now for our country. So I imagine when people come to you, there are a lot of strong feelings at play. And I'm hoping that you can talk about how do you do justice to those strong feelings and to do justice to the experiences, the suffering, the injustice that people endure without overwhelming people and making them just throw up their hands and say, this is a problem too big to solve. And what changes about all of that now that we're in a pandemic and have to do maybe more of this through a screen than before?
Yeah, so I feel like the answer to that question could be an entire course, but just to focus on, what is it, some pieces that we intentionally do to work toward having dialogue in an issue that some people would see as divisive or would find division. I think first, we intentionally include conversations with people the students will likely disagree with. And so, we have groups that come from all over the place, some whose families have migrated or who have someone who's undocumented in their family, some who come from white, middle, or upper class backgrounds. So just all over the place. And one of the experiences that tends to be really impactful for students is that they meet with a ranching community, or right now they're meeting with one couple from that ranching community that shares their experience of having ranch land that acts as the US-Mexico border. And they have been staunch and very public advocates of building the border wall. And so you know, we prepare students going into that experience to really be open. I think, you know, some of the things that they need to learn and unlearn, for example, there's this duality that like when I encounter someone, that I have to, based on the input of what they share with me, I have to put them into a category of someone who's good, who I agree with, or someone who's bad that I need to change in some way. So really kind of opening that up and recognizing that that you're not going to decide if someone's good or bad, but moving beyond that duality, and not to shame people for where they are, but really to try to peel back the layers and get really curious. And so putting on that posture of curiosity, and trying to get to a deeper place of what's the value here. So for example, you know, in our reflection or our processing after the conversation with the ranchers, one of the things, you know, first it's acknowledging the feelings. I think it's really important not to just push those down, but to say, you know, how did you feel when you had that conversation that might have been really intense? And just making the space to hear those things. And then also to ask the question, what was underneath of that? So for this person who thinks it's really important that we build a huge steel barrier on their land, why is it? Well, their reasoning that they give is for their own safety. They had a violent encounter with someone on their land, and so they have a fear based on that. Similarly, in the encounters with migrants, you have all of these families, many of whom are fleeing violence. And so when you kind of peel back the layers, you can see that these are people who actually have a similar value, which for them is safety. And when you can make those connections, all of a sudden it doesn't feel like those people are in totally different categories, but that there's actually this common value at the end of it. So I think for us, you know, that division, when we think about living into this pandemic world, it's a challenge. It can be a struggle to really dig deeper into the conversations and really draw responses out of people. But I think, you know, going back to putting on that lens of curiosity, just asking questions, getting really curious, and shifting the goal from, you know, changing someone else to learning as much as I can. If I go into a conversation with a goal of learning as much as I can and growing in relationship with that person, then it really changes the way that I'm able to encounter and interact.
Great, thanks, Tracy. Beth Ann, I was hoping that we could hear from you one more time to talk a little bit about some of the key opportunities that you'd like to embrace in the year ahead for Encounter, whether it's community-based learning or immersive learning, and then also the obstacles that need to be overcome as you see it, given your experience with high school students.
Yeah, a couple things. Because we're not going to be able to have the in-person encounters, I do hope that we can continue to bring folks to us virtually. We partner with so many organizations. Each grade partners with a different organization. So I'm still hoping that we can educate our students on those organizations, the work that they do, in a way to say that, you know what, your grade is part of this tradition of partnering and in this relationship with this organization. Hundreds of students have served there previously, and hundreds more will serve after you. So you might not have the experience, but you are still part of the tradition, you are part of the relationship, you are part of this partnership, and instill in them that sense of meaning, of like, how important is that to have a relationship and have those partnerships and to be in relationship. I'm also leaning on my juniors and seniors. You know, the students don't want to hear from me. I'm going to hopefully, last semester we started this, I asked juniors and seniors to give reflections on their service experiences over the course of their high school years, and invited underclassmen, the freshmen, the sophomores, the middle schoolers to join those conversations and to hear from the seniors and juniors about what it was like to serve at Ridge Ruxton and work with children with disabilities, and what it was like to go to Head Start and work with the preschoolers. And again, just to sort of inspire that understanding that it's these encounters that are important, and the experiences, things that you're going to learn might be the more important lesson might just be having those conversations and learning about somebody else and learning about their worldview and their experience. So the obstacles are just not having the opportunities for in-person, but I do think we can still make some really powerful virtual connections. One thing that I learned this summer, which has been really powerful for me, and I think I'm going to continue this year, is our work with social justice and learning about social justice issues. We really focused on policies. So we did a lot of reading and researching and discussing, but the focus was on policies. And surprisingly, it was not political. It did not turn into a game of politics or a game of blaming, you know, who was responsible for this and who's responsible for the impact. It became more of what policies have been in place that have prevented others from fully experiencing, what policies are in place that have benefited others and been disadvantaged for others. So that's been really powerful. Any social justice topic we've talked about, immigration, environmental justice, Native American lands, racial equity, many of those stem from policies. So just talking about redlining and education reform, how is it that the policies for allocating funds are still allocating funds decades ago? Those policies that were instituted decades ago, how are those effects still seen today? Things like redlining, you know, how do we still see these effects? You know, what are the current policies in immigration? How are they failing? How are they being, you know, where are they succeeding? That's been a great springboard for advocacy. I think I work a lot with middle schooler and high schoolers, and I think at the end of high school careers are really the developmentally appropriate time to have students learn about ways to advocate. And that's been really key. It's not so much a political party, it's not a political candidate, it's not a certain organization or situation, it's the policies that have been in place or were in place decades ago that have allowed some people to benefit while others have not experienced the same equality. And you still see those ramifications today. And so when you are advocating, so when you see that, we know that we have to change policies then. In order to enact change, we have to change policies. And that's been so important, especially in a electoral year. I mean, an election year, it's been, you know, how important is your vote? It's because the people you vote into office will be the ones that have the power to change local, state, and federal policies that might allocate funds differently, that might change policies in organizations. So that's something that's been really, that I think's been impactful, and that's something that we'll focus on a lot this year.
Great, thanks, Beth Ann. And Francisco, can you talk a little bit about how you envision using screens to help continue the work of encounter and cultivating solidarity in this interim until we're on the other side of the pandemic?
Well, you know, I think a good way to start is by using your last words in the question on the other side of the pandemic. I think we do see ourselves, or we do see a world after the pandemic, and the injustices will still be there. The injustices that we are currently going, you know, through right now are here, are very real. The pandemic has highlighted many of these injustices, have made them very clear. Not that they weren't before, but you know, there's a big highlight that's been put on them now. So we want to make sure that we continue to engage in these conversations because we need to understand that although many of our normal life routine activities are being put on hold, the injustices are not being put on hold. Solidarity can't be put on hold until we are on the other side of COVID. So we want to continue to use technology, you know, now that we have, this is the one thing that we have, we want to continue to use technology to highlight these experiences, to highlight these injustices, and to talk about them, and to see how we can engage in ways to, address them wherever we are in the world. One of the, I think, positive aspects of the technology that we have today is that we can be in different parts of the world, not just in the U.S., and talk about these injustices. I think the challenge, and I don't think anyone has this quite down, but the challenge is, how do we break this fourth wall? How do we go beyond just the screen and engage in these experiences in the best way possible? As CRISPAZ, we're really trying as to be imaginative in how we do this. And we hope that with time, we're able to do it better, but that's one of our biggest goals. How do we break this fourth wall? How do we make these types of encounters not seem as just a continuation of everything else that's being done through Zoom? So how do we intentionally find meaningful spaces to talk about this, and continue to educational piece? I think the educational piece, just as Beth Ann was, sharing with us, is extremely important. Understanding these policies and what these policies have done. And also, I would say, to push people into understanding how important it is for individuals to be involved in the political world, not in the ideological or party world, right? But in the political world, because our world, just as Beth Ann was pointing out, is driven by policy. We can't, especially people of faith, we can't be absent of allowing our faith to instruct us on how we should carry out our political life. So one of the things that we want to continue to do is reflect on the importance of being politically involved. Maybe not, sign up for this party or this other party, but make sure that you are politically involved. You have to be politically involved, not only for your sake, but for the sake of the people around you and the people that you come to encounter. We can't, and we can't disconnect our faith from that. We can't just look at our faith as something we put on Sundays for an hour, go to mass, and then take it off for the rest of the week and endorse or agree with very inhumane or very unchristian policies. So we want to continue to reflect on this, reflect on people understanding that we as Salvadorans and Latin Americans don't need labor, and challenge this idea of charity versus working for justice. Also this idea of listening to understand versus listening to respond, which is also part of this savior complex of I'll tell you what you should do, but engaging these encounters in a responsible way. I think we continue to do this online. I think there are spaces, definitely a lot of spaces for us to continue to reflect on these experiences. But we are also looking at kind of planting seeds in this virtual kind of time that we're in, so we can hopefully get people interested in participating in these encounters, whether they are here to El Salvador or whether they are to the Kino border or other countries in Latin America. I think encounters are extremely important. They allow humans to see what life is like for others, and how that is, how that connects me. And although initially we do say, this is how others live, we began to that there is a connection there that we can't deny. And that, unfortunately, is one of the challenges that we have with the encounters not being, face to face. But like I said, we are truly trying to find a way to break this fourth wall that is a challenge. And we can't deny that it is. But we just need to keep doing. I think we need to keep doing what we're doing for, the people that we have accompanied just for many years, and also just to finish up kind of with what I started. These people that are there, excuse me, will be there after the pandemic kind of, I don't know, goes away. I don't know if that would, I don't want to use a word that's not even appropriate. We don't know what will happen, but the injustices will be there. They're not on hold. They're not. So we need to continue to prepare ourselves to kind of hit the ground running when we get to the other side of COVID. And so we can't, we have no choice. We have to continue moving forward. Like I said, solidarity can't wait.
That's a great point to end on. Thank you, Francisco. And before we wrap up, I'd like to hear, Tracy, if maybe we could hear a little bit about your experience at Kino. On a screen, so much is catered to our interests, and we're so used to getting things on demand, right? And studies show that people are getting more and more used to instant gratification because you don't have to wait week by week to watch your favorite TV show. You can just binge the entire series in one go. So in the work of advocacy that you're doing, how do you help people take on this as a long-term project, where we don't get the immediate results that we want? Policy change is complex. It is a long time coming. So, with that vision of the long view in mind, how can we try to draw together the narrative, whether they're farmers or ranchers or people who've been displaced from their homes and migrating, or people who are showing up to Kino? How do we move from those experiences to trying to build a coalition that advocates for the policy reform that's causing so much suffering?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think part of that for us, like taking the long view, is why it's important to have partners, like in long-term relationships. It's interesting that you asked this, because in our Save Asylum campaign, just a couple of weeks ago, we all sat down, migrants, partners in Arizona, a number of folks together, and we had this conversation that, this isn't going to be solved tomorrow. This isn't something that's going to be solved by the election or even early next year. Really having strong protections for people that are fleeing violence and persecution is, it's going to be a long-term project. And so just having that honest conversation, and then I think defining like what a win looks like. So saying, for example, talking with a group, someone says, my Uncle Bob is so anti-immigrant, I want to have a conversation with him, but I don't know if it's worth my time. So, we talk about the spectrum of allies and how, maybe for Uncle Bob, you're not going to expect him tomorrow to be in a place where he's going to go with you to a march in support of Dreamers. Maybe your goal for him is just to get him to show up when you volunteer somewhere, or just to have a certain number of conversations where you listen to him, or have a conversation where you share about your experience with a migrant. So I think managing expectations and really defining what does it mean to win, and having that consistency in those partnerships is really important. And recognizing, the change that stories make in us. So like when I go to a presentation or I listen to someone talk about a topic, I'm not going to remember all of the data or the graphs that they share with me, but I will remember the way that I felt when I was listening to that presentation. And so recognizing that the same thing is true when we think about transformation for people when they're visiting with their members of Congress or decision makers, that really sharing those stories is the most impactful way to make change. And I think I always get hope. Something that I often share with students is that 15 years ago, in my high school Spanish class, I stood up and I argued very forcefully that we should build the wall. And people that were coming are breaking the law and they're criminals. And so here I am 15 years later, because of a series of encounters that I've had, So I think having examples of where transformation has been possible, even looking at Pope Francis, that, you know, he didn't start his time as a bishop, as a young bishop. He was much more conservative. He spoke out against liberation theology. And so to think about those examples and to hold those up as hopeful things, and the reality that transformation is possible and we can be a part of it.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. I really appreciate all that you've shared, and certainly you've given us a lot of food for thought for what's possible in terms of personal and social transformation. And we look forward to you hopefully being able to join us on October 21st.